Good afternoon and welcome to the Federal Railroad Administration's National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, Process for Federal Grant Applications webinar. Before we begin, I would like to take you through the items you see on your screen. The PowerPoint presentation for the webinar appears in the top left window of your dashboard. If you have problems viewing the presentation slides, ensure you are not using a web browser to view the webinar. If you are, exit the webinar and re-enter the webinar through the Adobe Connect desktop application. In the Troubleshooting Tips pod at the bottom left of your dashboard are some internet, network, video, and audio troubleshooting steps to ensure that participants can both hear and see the presentation. Next to the Troubleshooting Tips pod is the Web Links pod. To view the web links, double-click the title of the link. At the bottom right of the Adobe Connect dashboard is the Technical Support pod. This is where you can ask our support team members questions about any technical issues you are having. Above that is the Questions for Presenters pod for the question and answer session, and this is where you can ask questions that will be answered during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. Thank you to all of you who submitted pre-webinar questions. We will also be conducting polls during the webinar today, so please ensure that you are not viewing the presentation in full screen mode in order to participate in the polls. Please note that a recording of today's presentation will be uploaded to FRA's website in about a week. The presentation file will be available within the next day or so. Before the presentation begins, I would like to go over the webinar format. We'll start with a brief welcome, ask a few polling questions, and then launch into the presentation. We will ask additional polling questions in the middle and toward the end of the webinar. Following the presentation, we will have a question and answer session during which FRA will address the questions that are posted in the Questions for Presenters pod. Today's presenters include Andrea Martin, who is the Senior Environmental Protection Specialist at the Office of Railroad Policy and Development at FRA, and also Marlis Osterhus, who is the Chief Environment and Project Engineering Division for the Office of Railroad Policy and Development at FRA. All right, so we talked about polls just a minute ago, and we're going to have our very first 3 polls that we have. Our first question is, what type of organization do you represent? A, state, B, interstate compact, C, public agency or publicly chartered authority, D, local government, E, Amtrak, F, industry or consultant, G, other. And the way that you make your selection is just by simply pushing on or selecting the little round dot there. All right, we're going to go ahead and end that poll. It looks like 23% of attendees today have come from the state, 12% come from a public agency or publicly chartered authority, 10% from a local government, 46% coming from the industry or consultant, 9% coming from other, and about 1% coming from Amtrak. All right, our next question is, have you participated in a previous FRA webinar? A, yes, I have participated in a live webinar. Yes, I've watched a recorded FRA webinar online. Or no, I have not previously attended or watched any FRA webinars. All right, thank you all so much. I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. It looks like 50% have participated in a live FRA webinar, so welcome back. About 10% have watched a recorded FRA webinar online, and 40% have not previously attended or watched any FRA webinars. For those of you who have only seen the recorded ones or have not watched or attended, we welcome you to today's webinar. All right, next we have our last polling question for this section. Have you participated in any previous discretionary grant program webinars? Yes, I've participated in a live FRA webinar. Yes, I've watched a recorded FRA webinar online, and this has to do with the discretionary grant program webinars. No, I've not previously attended or watched any of the discretionary grant program FRA webinars. And then, of course, D is no experience. All right. I'm going to go ahead and end that poll. Looks like we've got 34% have participated in a live, 6% have watched one online, 42% have not previously or attended or watched any of the discretionary grant program webinars, and about 19% have no experience. All right. Now we are going to go over to Andrea Martin to go over the webinar outline.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to those who took time to join us today. My name is Andrea Martin, and my job at FRA as a Senior Environmental Protection Specialist is not only to host presentations like this one, but is to prepare environmental documents pursuant to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. And you'll hear that term a lot today. I also interpret and prepare environmental-related policy and procedures on behalf of my agency, as well as provide assistance to FRA customers such as our grantees and loan recipients. So we appreciate you coming today, and I'm going to go through the webinar outline. Marlis, before I do that, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Andrea. So folks, I'm Marlis Oster-Hughes, and I am FRA's Chief of Environment and Project Engineering. So my overall responsibilities are to manage and oversee all of FRA's environmental reviews. Andrea is one of the several of the environmental protection specialists that we have on our team. And again, as Andrea mentioned, we're very appreciative of folks that have joined us today and think that we have a packed agenda for you to cover quite a bit of information about NEPA and FRA's expectations. So I'll turn it back to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Marlis. And so, as Marlis hinted, the purpose of today's webinar is to provide a high-level overview of the NEPA process and provide practical strategies to help you navigate FRA's project development and environmental review process. Today, we will talk about what NEPA is and why it's required at FRA, as well as the type of environmental review documents prepared here, and talk through categorical exclusions known as CEs or Cat X's. They're most commonly prepared document here at FRA. And I want you to know that today you're receiving a condensed version of NEPA and environmental procedures, or a condensed version of NEPA and environmental procedures by attending this webinar, when their entire course is dedicated to NEPA and transportation decision making. We'll also discuss environmental considerations when applying for a federal grant. Pre-webinar questions came in about certain laws, and Marlis will present at a high level Section 106 and Section 4F considerations during project development later on in the presentation. We have also left plenty of time to address questions, including ones that were submitted in advance. So today's goal, in summary, these are our goals and hopeful outcomes for the presentation today as you prepare to apply for FRA's CRISI grant. Applications are due on grants.gov by November 29th. We will be referring to the Notice of Funding Availability, or the acronym NOFO, throughout the presentation. One bit of advice is to read the 2021 NOFO carefully. It can be found on the FRA website or grants.gov. By the end of today's presentation, we want you to have a clearer understanding of NEPA and why it is required at FRA. This information will help you be better prepared to complete a competitive FRA grant application. We will get started with today's presentation with I believe, another poll, and then Marlis will present on what is NEPA and why it is required and the types of NEPA documents we have here at FRA.
Thanks, Andrea, and thanks for folks for taking this poll. Are you familiar with the NEPA process? The NEPA process is a process that Great, Mary. I think that we can close the poll now. It looks like we have about 87% of the folks that are attending the webinar today that are familiar, which is great. So for many of you, these first couple of slides that I'm about to cover that really talk at a very high level of what NEPA is and why is it required will be a refresher. But for those that have not worked with NEPA very much, we certainly want to cover the basics. So before we get into FRA's expectations or what we need for grants, we really do need to make sure everyone has that common understanding of what is NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act, and why is it required? So just some of the very basics about NEPA. NEPA is the National Environmental Policy Act, actually of 1969, but one little bit of trivia is that it was signed into federal law by President Nixon on January 1st of 1970. So what NEPA does, or what it is, it establishes a national environmental policy and provides a framework for environmental planning, environmental decision-making by federal agencies. It is important to note this is a procedural statute that sets up the steps that agencies must follow, does not specify a specific outcome of the process, but rather establishes that framework for agencies to consider and analyze the environmental impacts and effects of the projects that are under review by the agencies. NEPA itself also set up the Council on Environmental Quality, or CEQ, which is also commonly referred as, and we will mention CEQ a couple times during our presentation today, in particular about regulations that have been established by CEQ. One important note is that NEPA applies to all federal agencies in their actions. It does involve others and state agencies, and many of you are on the call today when you are applying for a federal approval or an action that triggers NEPA for federal agencies. So what does it mean for agencies? So agency responsibilities under NEPA are for agency decision makers need to be informed of the environmental impacts and consequences of our actions. And through the NEPA process, which we'll talk about in depth today, agencies determine if our proposed actions, the actions that are in front of the agency, will have significant environmental and related social and economic effects and impacts. You're going to hear the term several times today when we're talking about the significance of environmental impacts. That's a key issue that agencies need to do. We need to determine the significance of the impacts of the actions ahead of us. There's no specific threshold for when there is a specific significant impact. Rather, it is based on the context and intensity of the impacts that are happening to a given resource or to a given area. As part of the NEPA process, agencies are looking to avoid, minimize, and mitigate impacts to impacted resources to the extent that we can. So I've mentioned the term action or approvals, and that when we're talking about FRA and what is a trigger or requirement for why we need to do NEPA at FRA, most often, our actions are broad, but are grouped into these three basic categories. One is funding. Most all of you are joining here today in anticipation of applying for a CRISI grant. So that is a perfect example of if a project is selected for funding through FRA, that grant, or if you're in the case of other programs applying for a loan, would be considered an action that FRA has to consider under NEPA. Outside of just simple funding requests, there's times that FRA has actions when we're issuing regulations or approving a technology. So there will be times that FRA has NEPA compliance requirements, even when funding is not required. But most often, and the most common trigger for FRA's environmental reviews are largely our funding. It is also important to note, as NEPA does apply to all federal agencies, today we're going to be focusing most on our FRA actions and FRA expectations, but other federal agencies like the Corps of Engineers or the Coast Guard do have NEPA responsibilities if applicants are applying for, say, a Corps of Engineers wetland permit or Coast Guard bridge permit. So you may hear us several times also talking about other agencies' environmental requirements as well. One central concept that we'll be talking about today is we're talking about the National Environmental Policy Act as a specific law, but the process that we use is actually often referred to as an umbrella, where we are looking not just for the specific requirements of the National Environmental Policy Act, but rather an umbrella of other statutes, regulations, executive orders, and requirements that relate to the environment. This umbrella shows, different types of environmental laws that may come into play for a given project. Could be the Clean Air Act, it could be the Clean Water Act. Two environmental requirements that we're going to talk in a little more detail, which are quite common for FRA projects, is Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, where we have some more information on. Also, I'm going to talk just a little bit later in the presentation about the U.S. DOT Transportation Act of 1966, more commonly referred to as Section 4F. So these two we're going to highlight and provide a little more detail. But as Andrea mentioned, classes like this and NEPA, or even there's individual materials and classes that can be days long for each of these different environmental laws. And so what we really want folks to walk away with today is an understanding that you may have a more simplified NEPA review, but you may have other environmental requirements like Section 106 or 4F or a Clean Water Act permit from the Corps that may be required. And when possible, we try to use the umbrella approach to consider how a particular project's environmental reviews under NEPA and all of these environmental laws would be considered. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the rules and requirements. So there's NEPA regulations. I mentioned first slide about NEPA. NEPA established the Council on Environmental Quality. NEPA established, CEQ established NEPA regulations that apply to all federal agencies. Generally, this requires all agencies to assess the environmental effects and proposed actions of our actions prior to making a decision or approving a project. There's a whole set of environmental regulations that each agency considers. One thing that CEQ originally asked many, many years ago is for each agency to establish their own NEPA procedures. So us at FRA and other modes like FHB and FTA have had NEPA procedures for quite some time. We are excited and want to remind everyone that since 2018, FRA actually joined what were existing FHWA and FTA regulations. So now the surface transportation modes have common NEPA procedures. Those procedures for FRA, FTA, and FHWA can be found in Title 23, the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR 771. So what we have also tried to do in our presentation today is to provide where you can get more information. So in many of our slides, you will see a reference to where you can go get more information, either on a link or a note, like in the first bullet here, where you can get more information about the CEQ regulations, or in the case of the last bullet, where you can get more information regarding our NEPA regulations.
All right, now for time for poll 5. Have you completed NEPA for an FRA project? Yes for categorical, wow, I really cannot speak today, I apologize. Categorical exclusion, yes for environmental assessment, yes for environmental impact statement. No, I have not completed NEPA for an FRA project. All right, so we're going to go ahead and end that poll now. Thank you so much. It looks like we've got about 28% who have for the categorical exclusion, 6% for the environmental assessment, 15% for the environmental impact statement, and 51 who have not completed NEPA for an FRA project. And I believe we're going over to Andrea.
No, I'm going to keep on this one, Mary. Yeah, thank you, Mary. So thank you for that poll. It's really helpful to know for, as we're presenting today, what folks' experience are. So it looks like that there's a range of folks that have worked on FRA documents before, but also I think almost a majority that have not worked. So we again, at a high level, are going to be talking about the different kinds of environmental documents that are used at FRA, and then going to focus quite significantly on expectations related to our categorical exclusions, which is the document type that we most often use. So you're going to hear a term class of action. What that is really what type of NEPA document we're going to prepare, and it is determined by the significance of the impact. Several slides ago, I mentioned about the kind of key concept of the significance of environmental impacts, and really that is going to determine and kind of set off which path. So that's the NEPA process, and generally, if you think about it in kind of a roadmap or a flow chart, there's going to be 3 different paths, and that path initially is determined by what we believe the significance or level of impacts, the context and intensity in which those impacts are going to happen in, that would prescribe the level of documentation. So there's 3 types of NEPA documents that project sponsors will prepare in cooperation with us here at FRA. Again, here's a citation where you can get more information in detail and read in our regulations about these 3 types of classes of action. The first is categorical exclusion, or a CE. The second is an environmental assessment, which would be concluded potentially in a finding of no significant impact, often referred to as a FONSI. And the environmental document type that often is talked about the most, but it actually represents generally the smallest number of actual projects we do, is the environmental impact statement that would end in or conclude with a record of decision. So a little bit more about these 3 document types. Again, as I mentioned, most folks are familiar when they hear about NEPA as large, very large EISs. Those tend to be the environmental review processes and environmental documents associated with our most complex projects that have the most kind of extensive, in-depth environmental reviews. They have generally the most, the highest potential for significant environmental impacts, the largest projects, often new alignments and new corridors or new station projects. And with that, with this being the most extensive process, there's generally more public involvement, public outreach, and interagency expectations. Again, in today's webinar, we are not going to focus much on our EIS processes. There is certainly a lot of information both in our regulations. You can get more information, but we're going to focus a bit more today on this last category of CEs, since that is what we are encountering the most. But before I get to talk a little bit about CEs, I will also mention that environmental assessments are a type of NEPA document that are used by agencies or here at FRA to determine if we're not quite sure, if we think at the beginning, unsure of the type of significant impacts that this may have, a particular proposal or project may have, we can use an environmental assessment as a tool to determine that. If we concluded in the middle of a process where we're working on an EA that we had a significant impact, we can take that off ramp, go and begin an EIS. If we conclude the process of an environmental assessment and determine that there are no significant impacts, then we would issue a finding of no significant impacts. The public, there generally is a public comment period associated with our environmental assessments, but again, the distinction is if folks are familiar with EISs, that tends to be a more in-depth public involvement process, but we do seek environmental or public comments during our environmental assessments. Again, the third category of NEPA documents or categorical exclusions generally represents about over 90%. So in our last, I think, calendar year, about 90% of the projects that FRA had under environmental review utilized a categorical exclusion. That's why we are focusing more on that today than these other types of environmental documents. I'm going to hand it over to Andrea to drill down today into more about our FRA CEs and expectations associated with them. Andrea?
Thank you, Marlis. As Marlis just mentioned, there are 3 types of NEPA documents that FRA project sponsors may be required to prepare: an EIS, EA, and a categorical exclusion, or CE. I will go through the next series of slides to talk more about CEs. One thing to remember, the environmental issues encountered for a CE should be minimal, and there should only be those resources that apply to the project under consideration. CEs represent the highest amount of NEPA documents at FRA. And we had over 90% in 2020 of our NEPA documents were categorical exclusions. Oops, trying to go forward here. Since 2018, FRA has expanded its list of CEs listed under 23 CFR 771 Part 116. In 2020, I mentioned that over 90% of the NEPA documents that FRA we facilitated the completion of were category exclusions. There are 22 categories of CEs listed in our listed at 23 CFR 771 Part 116. And we share those, as Marlis mentioned, we share those regulations with both Federal Transit Administration and Federal Highway Administration. And so that means FRA projects may also use CEs specific to FTA or FHWA. That could be such in the sidewalks or utility work. There are some examples. CEs are the most common NEPA documents here at FRA, and they all have certain requirements for completion, such as looking at the resources that were listed under the NEPA umbrella at the beginning of the presentation. So some of these categories, just part of them are listed. We have planning and design activities. That would be for your CRISI NOFO under track 1, or positive train control, safety and security improvements. That could be found under track 2 or track 3. Minor rail line additions or track structure maintenance and improvement. That's like track rehab or replacement. Minor rail line additions, new track within the right-of-way. Property acquisition, including safety equipment and rolling stock. Bridge rehabilitation or replacement. Emergency repairs and the construction of small structures. These are all some common examples of projects or types of projects that we see that are categorically excluded. But one of my, the best advice I can give you is to actually get to know the FRA's CE worksheet. It's online, and you will, this presentation will be available online in probably a week or so. And all these links will get you to these places. But the CE worksheet is a comprehensive place, and the companion guide, which is also on the FRA website, not only lists the resources for category exclusion, but this information can be used in the preparation of any NEPA document FRA. So it's a good place where all of the resources are listed. Oh, and I was just notified that the presentation file will actually be available in the next day or so on the FRA website. That's better than in a week. So what I'm just going to go through the bullets here. What is the purpose and need of your project? The purpose is usually the problem, and the need is how your proposed project solves or fixes the identified problem. When you are applying for an FRA grant or any grant in general, please know what your project is and let us know in your application. You'd be surprised how many applicants do not have a basic project description in their grant application. For those projects that may have some ground disturbance, please include a study area map. This could be from an online mapping tool or a plat map with an outline of the study area. Many applicants also include cross sections or engineering designs and drawings, most likely if they're applying to track 3, which is final design in construction. With that, in the CE worksheet, you'll find each of the resources listed. So include a summary, or even if you don't complete the CE worksheet or draft for your application, you could state this in the application and include a brief summary of resources and potential project impact specific to your project area. And you can do this by using the CE guidebook. There's some good information in there on each of the different types of resources, but please do not list resources that are not in your project vicinity. For example, if your project is located in inland and an agricultural area and is not adjacent to a coastline, then the coastal resources will not need to be evaluated. in your project development. The CE may also include commitments to project design and other measures to minimize or eliminate impacts and different types of required permits if known. And also include attachments or incorporation by reference where possible if any technical memorandum or reports which support the document or your project. If your project has past environmental studies or permits, I believe one of the questions that came in prior is they had they had a Corps of Engineer approval, and I would include that with your application that we can use to substantiate your project. So please do include that with your application. And also, just bottom line is inform FRA. Document as much as you can in your grant application, not only in the environmental section, but I know they limit it to have a page limit on the grant applications, but try to jam pack those pages with as much information as possible, because we can only evaluate what we receive in your grant application. And here is a snapshot of the CE worksheet. And this is a slide is a close-up of a page there outlining 2 resource considerations that Marlis will go into depth in the next set of slides for section 106 and section 4F that we'll get to in a little bit. But she has some good information that you can take away with you today. Advance my slide here, and we have a quick poll, and I will rejoin you after the poll.
All right, thank you so much. Our polling question is, do you now have a better understanding of FRA CE requirements for completion or where to find additional information? All right, I'm going to go ahead and end that poll right now. It looks like 70% said yes, 27% said yes somewhat, and 3% needs more information. And I would also point out, if you are not viewing the presentation in full screen mode, underneath the presentation is the web links. Web link number 1 is the FRA webinars page, and that's where the items are going to be posted the next day or two. And then the recording will be posted in about a week. And then underneath that, web link number 6 is the FRA list of CEs. Number 7 is the CE worksheet, and number 8 is the workbook. All right, now back to Andrea.
Great, and thank you for those who answered the poll, and for those who aren't quite sure if we're answering your questions or getting enough information on NEPA or CEs or in general, hopefully you'll be provided some clarity later on in or throughout the presentation. And our information, Marlis and my contact information, is at the end of the presentation. And please, we're happy to have a meeting or answer questions as they come up. The next set of slides, I'll be going through environmental considerations for applying not only to an FRA grant, but these tips are helpful for any DOT discretionary grant program. And so, as I can't stress this enough, one bit of advice is to read the NOFO carefully. And as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, it can be found on the FRA website or grants.gov. Similar to what I mentioned about information to put in your application or draft CE, please provide as much information as you know about your project, its description, location, and even if there's not an address, list mileposts or longitude or latitude, as well as any anticipated impacts or permits. This information is outlined, including where to find it, in the online CE or category exclusion companion guide. We only have what you give us in your application to determine the environmental readiness of your project, so please add more information than less. And then and then provide more than less. And then this year, there's one thing to take into consideration. We should be stating in our applications how maybe your project takes trucks off the road by improving freight operations, or how that taking trucks off the road improve emissions, or and improve climate change, or how community benefits from safer grade crossings, and how it's easier to get to work with better connectivity, or jobs are going to be created through bringing construction to the community. So these are just some additional considerations that the NOFO, just try to explain a little bit. You may just think outside the box, saying, well, I'm going to have a better freight operation. Well, why does that, help? Being more efficient helps with the emissions, and then you're getting goods to the people that need it, and so that helps everybody out. And please state that. And then describe the planning project to date. And this just reinforces what we shared on the other slide. So document any past or present environmental studies associated with your proposed project in the grant application, any previous approved FRA, FTA, or FHWA project related to the grant proposal. Maybe you have a bridge improvement and you actually have a permit with the Coast Guard. We could take a look at that, and let's say your project is to reconstruct an approach on the bridge, and we could go and look at the environmental work that has been done to actually replace the spans of the bridge. So everything is tied together, and we will be creative and do our best to work with you if your grant is awarded through that environmental process, whether it's been done previously or we're working in the environmental process. If it's something that needs to be done, we'll do our best to get that completed efficiently as possible. And also document any past or anticipated public outreach or agency meetings about the proposed project if appropriate. And I say if appropriate because sometimes, or you may be applying for planning or research or procurement type of grant, and you may not have outreach. So this is pretty much for if a ground disturbance or you're changing the landscape. You're going to want to let your community know. And so if you're looking at the PE NEPA or Final Design and Construction grant, consider providing a draft CE with your grant application, or documenting as much as you can in your grant application. If unable to complete a draft DCE worksheet, we recommend at minimum identifying the anticipated categorical exclusion category that the project may fall under. So, and we listed it out again. And so let's say that you are looking at signals and new gates, and you put that in your application. Just make sure you put the right number. And for certain proposals not requiring ground disturbance, such as training and research, which is found in track 4, Simplified CE Documentation, once your grant is awarded, FRA may be considered. So if you have a project with ground disturbance, it's a much different environmental impacts than providing training or tools to your staff. If your project does not fit clearly within a CE category, an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement might be needed depending on the potential for significant environmental impacts. And we can also look to category, as I mentioned before, CE categories at Federal Highway Administration and Federal Transit Administration. And an environmental specialist at FRA will work with you when your grant is approved through that process. If it's something that doesn't fit clearly within a CE category. And so the next set of slides, I'm going to hand off to Marlis, and she's going to go in a high level, but dedicate the next portion of our presentation to two considerations that we get a lot of questions on, and a lot of our projects have these two types of resources, which would be protected under Section 106 and Section 4F. Marlis?
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. So again, we picked these two out of the many different types of environmental laws and regulations that were under that umbrella in the first couple of slides. And largely we picked these two because they are the most common types of other environmental reviews that are associated with our railroad infrastructure projects. And in particular, the National Historic Preservation Act. I'm going to have just a handful of slides here, but really trying to provide a little more information because of how common, given the age of the national rail network, given the development and the fact that many of our rail infrastructure elements have been around for quite some time. This is a very common environmental review requirement that comes up. And so again, from an umbrella perspective, we may very easily be able to determine that the type or category of action very easily falls within a CE, but you cannot stop there. We need to understand if, given the age of the infrastructure or a bridge that you're working on is historic, even though it may very easily fit into a category in a CE that you see that we've mentioned many times in 771116. It is really important to know what types of other environmental reviews, in particular, like the National Historic Preservation Act. So before I talk too much about our expectations and what some of the tools we have to go through the historic preservation reviews, I want to just explain a little bit of what it is. So NHPA, or the National Historic Preservation Act, was enacted in 1966. It has this section one. There's the section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act that requires federal agencies to consider the impact of their actions on historic properties. This, like NEPA, is generally a procedural law. It sets out decision-making process established by the the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, or ACHP. The ACHP has established regulations. Again, here is a link to where you can get more information about the Historic Preservation ACHP regulations and requirements. And generally, the Section 106 process does afford ACHP a reasonable opportunity to be involved and to comment on projects for implementation. A little bit more about the process and what's protected under Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. The term historic properties, I want folks to think about, there's certainly a broad category of properties that may be considered historic: districts, sites, buildings, structures. Generally, but not in all cases, it is resources that are 50 years or age or older, but sometimes we actually do look in certain circumstances for things that are less than 50 years, if there's a very significant historic event that happened within 50 years, or in the case of a project that's going to be implemented over some time, we may be able to start looking, you say it's something that's like 45 years old, if we know the project's going to be implemented over a very large number of years. Those projects generally also that are listed or eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. The significance of a particular property can be determined if it has significance at the local level, the state level, or the national level. Properties can be deemed historic because of their association with events, people, or cultural trends. In some cases, engineering advancement or architectural advancements, or if it's the last, or single bridge associated with a specific type of technology. The Section 106 process really is not just to consider things that are on a specific list now, but rather eligible for that list. Those are terminologies you will hear when you're in and working on the Section 106 process with us. So within the railroad world, examples of types of historic railroad infrastructure. So if your CRISI project or other project is looking to replace, work, or upgrade on a historic resource, often we're seeing bridges, tunnels, culverts, passenger stations, or operation buildings may require, given the age or the significance of those resources. We would have examples of many different types of historic railroad infrastructure in these categories. If your project's impacting or is in the vicinity of historic resources, these types of resources, we do encourage you to identify that up front. Again, we're sharing this information today because some folks think only about the NEPA process. They're not thinking about the other environmental requirements that may accrue to a project. So if your project qualifies for CE, as I've mentioned, even if it's a very, one of a more simple, very easily fits in a category, folks need to be aware that it may still require a Section 106 review in coordination with the State Historic Preservation Officer or a SHPO. And in some cases, we actually, grantee may need to procure or get assistance from a qualified consultant to be able to complete the process. This is, again, less about putting your application together, but more about setting an expectation for what to expect if a grant is awarded and we have to conduct a Section 106 process. There may be the need for the applicant to acquire the services of a qualified consultant to help us complete the process. This, like the NEPA process, must be completed. The Section 106 process must be complete prior to the obligation of an FRA grant or an FRA action is taken and the project is implemented. We do at FRA have tools to expedite the Section 106 process. One important one that I'd like to note that can be commonly applied to the types of projects most often applied for in CRISI. We have something called the Section 106 program comment for rail rights-of-way. It actually dates back to a provision that was in the FAST Act in 2015. We at FRA and the USDOT worked with the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation to establish a program comment. We have two components to this program comment. I'm really only going to focus on one today, and that is the activities-based approach. We also have an optional property-based approach that really is not in wide use. So I'm going to focus on what would be most applicable to many folks within the webinar today, and that's our activities-based approach. We've established a exempted activities list, which I have on the next slide, and we have information of how to in our resources slides on how to get more information. But generally, the activities-based approach has identified a long list of types of activities that have foreseeable or minimal not adverse effects to historic properties, and we've provided a streamlined and expedited process and way in which to complete our 106 requirements for on activities that fall within this exempted activities list. We have 95 total exempted activities. They generally fall into these 13 category types, including track and track bed work, some bridges and tunnels, railroad buildings and platforms, signals and power generation, erosion control. So that you can see here, there's these different types of actions. I think it is important to note examples of projects that generally would not qualify or be on this exempt activities list, or full demolitions or replacement of railroad bridges, or the building of a new station or a rail line. When an exempt activity covers one or more activities within the scope of work, it provides really a shortcut to completing the Section 106 process and usually can be completed in a shortened time frame. So these, 5 slides that I had here for you about the Section 106 process really is just a very high level overview of some expectations and process requirements associated with 106. We actually have a webinar online that some of our environmental specialists and our federal preservation officer provided a couple of years ago, a full hour and a half long webinar just on Section 106. We also have a full webinar just on the program comment. So if this information today leads what we've shared that you believe you may have a historic preservation requirement associated with your grant application, or you believe you can may be able to apply the program comment, I would encourage folks to get some additional information on those resources that we have available. And then if you have any questions, you can certainly follow with us. But again, most often, but not all of our projects have some type of environmental or some type of historic and cultural resources that are considered under Section 106 given the age of our system. So next, I just have one slide here on Section 4F. Folks are not familiar. Again, same year actually that the National Historic Preservation Act was passed, a law under the U.S. DOT Act of 1966 that included a provision to protect publicly owned parks, recreation facilities, wildlife refuges, and certain historic properties was put in place. Again, happened around the same time. There's some overlap between the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 4F of the U.S. DOT Act and the Protection of Historic Properties. This statute or this law is considered to be one of a substantive law that requires a specific outcome. If properties that are protected by 4F are going to be impacted by your project and those impacts can be avoided, then we are required to avoid those impacts. In many cases, we're not able to avoid impacts to all of these properties. So you may be required and likely required to consider what can be done to minimize impact to these properties. Again, this is just one slide to highlight that you may have resources impacted your project that may require consideration under Section 4F. As Andrea mentioned, there is information on our CE checklist. Does not mean you may not be able to apply an CE to a project, but we may have considerations for Section 4F that need to comply with as part of our NEPA process. So really, I'm including this here as a flag for you to know that Section 4F, as well as Section 106, or other environmental reviews that may be triggered as a part of the application you apply for if it gets awarded. So I'm going to pass it to Andrea to give you a little bit of an overview of the types of resources and tools that we have at FRA to help you through this process.
Thank you, Marlis. And the next set of slides are going to be links that you will be able to access. And these links, the first set are internal to DOT or FRA. It's our procedures, as well as our categorical exclusion worksheet, if you want to take a look at that, as well as the companion guide, which is a comprehensive list of types of information on filling out the categorical exclusion, or if you want to read up on a resource in general. So someone asked about mapping. We don't have mapping preference, and you can use online maps, a copy of a topo map with the outline of your project location. And so we don't have mapping preferences, but there are online mapping tools that can help identify your resources. And those links are in the categories in our companion guide. And then there's a list of NEPA resources at DOT. And here's some more information that Marlis talked about, the Council on Environmental Quality, who oversees NEPA, and the Citizens Guide to NEPA, which is important if you want to take a look at to see your role in project development. And then I always refer back to the AASHTO Center for Environmental Excellence Practitioners Handbook. There's a series of PDFs for all the resource areas and then different types of the NEPA process. And so there's a PDF of this handbook, as well as some webinars that are free and very informative. It's set up through FHWA or AASHTO, but since we do share environmental or NEPA regulations, a lot of that can be transferred to our project development. And then these are some helpful links on the Section 106 that Marlis talked about, the regulation itself, the ACHP, the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, their review process, and they also have a citizen's guide to Section 106 review. And then we do have webinars on the FRA website, and the webinar, there's one on Section 106 as well as the program comment. And we'll try to address, I think some questions came in about the program comment. I'm sure you can note it in your application, but we have to verify your project. It becomes a project at FRA, it comes in as a grant, and then see if it qualifies. And we do that here, but sure you can note it that it may qualify in your application, but just know that the Section 106 still may apply if there are other resources in the area. And so my helpful hints and key takeaway, I can't stress this enough, is read the Notice of Funding Availability. And that has everything laid out what should be in your grant application, and provide more environmental information than less with your application. I know they give you, I think, 25 pages, but please read the NOFO carefully and try to fit in as much information as you can within those 25 pages. And that's because that's what the reviewers are looking at here at FRA. When you submit your grant application, that's all we have to go off of. So fully describe your project, its purpose and anticipated impacts, clearly describe how your project will address climate change, environmental justice, and racial equality considerations that are in the notice of a funding opportunity. I kind of touched on that earlier in the presentation. So you could talk about taking truck traffic off the road, using more efficient types of equipment, providing jobs, connecting communities. And so those are just different things. I know there's one project sponsor out there who has a commitment to, this is for past projects, but they have a commitment to employ local people. And they have that commitment to local the population. So they have a high amount of environmental justice community working on constructing and implementing their project. If your application is selected for funding, compliance with NEPA and potentially several other environmental laws will be necessary. So please state as much information as you can in the application, but also know that we have to review that information once it's awarded at FRA, and it still may have environmental laws that we need to address and consult on. And completing the NEPA process may require assistance from qualified consultants to evaluate impacts to certain resources like the wetlands, Section 106 or Section 4F, and even Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act. And please check out the companion guide. It's an online resources contained there to help complete the CE worksheet or complete the environmental documentation for resources within your project area in your application. And if possible, if applicable, provide a draft CE with your application and talk to your federal partner. This is a main link email, but you can also email myself or Marlis directly, and our contact information is at the end of the presentation today. So those links, they should all work, but please fully utilize the information on FRA's website. Look at old webinars. If you're still unsure, contact us, and hopefully our tips will help you expedite your environmental review process once your grant is awarded here. And so FRA will verify and approve NEPA once all the documentation is put together for your grant requirements and after the grant is awarded in order to obligate that.
So we really do appreciate everyone's participation today. It looks like that it was a helpful webinar for most. If there was any particular questions you have, or if you were looking for something, feel free to follow up with Andrea and I. We again have a limited amount of time to try to cover a ton of information, and really want the takeaways for you today to know where you can get more information. So we're so appreciative of your participation today and your interest in applying for CRISI grants for FRA, and really appreciate your participation and hope you have a great rest of the day.